Hey guys, in this video I'll be showing you how I make vented squish molds. Before that though, I thought I'd answer some common questions and give a quick overview. We'll be going over why I make vented squish molds, what the raw dice look like when they come out, the previous versions I've made to get to the ones I have now, along with the reasons why changes were necessary to the older versions, the decision-making process on which face you want to use as the squish face, actually making the molds, and a very quick sample pour at the end just to show you what that looks like. The timestamps for each of these sections will be linked in the description so you can skip to the section that you want. So why vented squish molds? There are many different types of molds and even more variations on each type of mold. The most common though are sprue molds, squish molds, and cap molds. I haven't made cap molds, so I'm going to speak mostly about sprue molds and squish molds. Sprue molds are great for beginners. They're easy to make, they're easy to use, and I started with sprue molds, but at some point you just want to switch to something with less cleanup and easier access. Techniques like dirty pours or the Petri method are much easier with squish molds where you can have an open face than they are with sprue molds where you only have a tiny vent to work through. Squish molds have also fully eliminated my need for pipettes or syringes, though depending on the style of dice that you want to create, these things can still be necessary to achieve certain effects. The problem with most cap and squish molds is that you need to overfill them to accommodate for resin shrinkage, and there's no escape for bubbles that rise to the surface. Especially for pressure pot users, this can result in huge voids and craters in your dice. The solution to that is to create vents in your molds, so you can have a reservoir, hence vented squish molds. Here are some dice that were pulled from my latest iteration of these molds. These are completely raw, they're unpolished, unsanded. The only thing I've done is I've clipped the sprues off. I've clipped the reservoirs off, and I've used a pair of trimmers, they look like this, to sort of take off some of the flashing around the edge, and I'm going to show you some examples of what the dice look like, or what they should look like if it's been done correctly. Here's a D12. As you can see, the 12 face needs polishing and sanding. I've cut the sprue pretty flush against the surface using an X-Acto blade, so you just need to polish and sand the one face that you choose is face up. The rest of the faces are shiny and they don't really need any work. This of course depends on how you treat your masters and how finished you get those before making molds out of them. But for the most part, all of these dice, except the D20 of course, you only need to sand and polish one face. Sorry, trying to get the camera to focus. With the D20 you need to polish two faces, and for me I chose the 20 and the 8 face to be facing up. But I feel this also really helps me get a good idea of what the dice are going to look like when they're finished, because they come out so clean to begin with. And of course, over time, as your molds deteriorate, you might start seeing some abrasions on the surfaces that you would need to sand away later. But for now, for the first few pulls at least, you should have minimal work. Sand and polish one face only. There have been 3 iterations of these squish molds, and I'm going to show you the pros and cons of each one, starting from the first iteration, which are these, and why I made edits and how we ended up with the ones that I have today. So these are the first ones that I made, and I made one set. As you can see, it's a bit shallower. It doesn't have the character marks on the inside, it only has them on the edge, which I cut in afterwards. And the D20 face only has one opening. If I'm not wrong, this is the D10, and you see it's also pretty shallow. I have 3 marks on the side here, and on the D percentile I have 4 marks, just to help me distinguish between the two. These days I don't add the character mark difference between the D10 and the D percentile. I just take a look and make sure my caps are where they need to be before I pour, because I pour with more than one set of molds now, so that's important either way. But as you can see, it sort of just slides in. It doesn't have any grip. When there's resin in there, it's really easy for it to slide around. But I never suffered any raised surfaces with these, and I'm not entirely sure why, but I never had problems with that. Once you press them in, they basically stay there. Again, I have no idea why, since I did suffer raised edges with these, or raised faces. So these are the first ones, and they're kind of flimsy. These are pretty small. It's hard to keep track of them sometimes. And as you can see, they're really beat up, so it's about time that I cut them up and put them in some new molds. These are the second iteration. This is when I learned that my silicone pot life is way too short to do a full pour at a time, and which is why you'll see here I have some of these set have really ugly caps because the silicone just sort of like hardened in a lump up here while I was pouring, mid-pour. So this is the D20, and this is a chunky D20, I think. This is when I started doing 2 faces on the D20 instead of just the one. It makes it easier to pull out and makes it easier to put in large inclusions. I have one character mark here, which I found still allows it to slip around pretty easily. So the edges are pretty thin because I wanted more space for my reservoir, but that's something that I ended up giving up later because I could make enough space in the cap itself with my new and improved method. This one is, I think, the D12, yeah. And as you can see, given the fickle nature of my silicone, I didn't have enough or the time to pour it up to reach the top, so I do suffer some raised surfaces with these. Even on the ones where there is enough silicone in the cap, they will sometimes slide upwards anyway, and I'm not sure what causes that. I'm sure it has something to do with the shape of this squish part. But yeah, they still kind of slip around if you squish it in. Like here you can see the edge is really flimsy, so it gets like folded down underneath the cap sometimes when you try to put it in, and you've got to adjust it to flip it around. So I made the edges less flimsy and thicker on my most recent ones. And now we have these. These are a method I think I will swear by forever. I say that now. So this is a regular size D20. As you can see, it has 2 marks here instead for orientation, plus an indentation on each side to help it stay in place, make sure it's not tilting or anything. It has a rim here that allows you to sort of actually squish it in, so it doesn't raise up at all. Once this cap is in, it is in, although it is still easy to take out, so you're not suffering any consequences there. The way that you put these in, the easiest for me is I found that if you just like slide it in vent side facing you and just make sure that you push it in this way first, and that will help any bubbles that are trapped along the outer edge to sort of be pushed towards the vent side, which is what you want. And you just squeeze it in, give it a little nudge, and it will pop right in. And you shouldn't have any gaps along the sides, you shouldn't have gaps anywhere. It should squish right in and be sturdy and secure until you decide it's time to pull it out again, at which case you just give it a gentle lift. It will be easier to slide in if there's a little bit of resin at the bottom. It sort of lubricates it, and I found that the flashing from that doesn't really make it more difficult to pull out either. This is a D8, and it's just the one face for the other dice. So it's built the same way, just with one face instead of 2. And again, to put it in, you just slide vent facing towards you, and you slip it in. And you can see if there are gaps in the side, you've done something wrong. So you need to make sure, here you can see what's happened. I hope you can see, it's hard to see because the silicone is white, but you can see that the bottom is sort of propped up against the ledge, so you want to slide that side in. And there you have it. Give it a little squish, make sure it's secure in there. These are what I use now, and I think they're perfect. They work exactly for me for the type of dice that I want to make. All right, I want to talk a little bit about how to choose which face you want facing upwards, which face you want to put the squish part on. In the first iterations of this mold, I chose the smaller numbers, that is the 1 and the 7 in this case, the 1 especially. And as you can see on this D12, it's also the 1 face, and I always chose the 1 face in these molds because I thought the 1 face is going to be whichever face you choose to put under the squish part is going to be the face that has the risk for the most character marks. It has the risk for the most flaws. It has the risk for the most scratches and bruises. Those will be on the 1 face, or the face that you choose to put the squish on. And that's what happened with this die. As you can see, the 1 and the 7 at the top, they're polished pretty well, so there are no character marks, and that's how I ended up choosing now to instead switch it around. So as you can see here, I'm holding a D8, and on the 1, you can see all of the cool stuff I put in it. You can see the inclusions, but on the 8, you just see some, well, it's a lovely color, but it's not as interesting. And I kind of want the high numbers to be on the interesting side of the die. Like here, I don't want the die to say 1 and 7 when it's facing up. I want it to say 20. I want you to be happy when you see the inclusions that are in it. So given that these sanded away pretty well, and this is with my old iteration with the raised faces, they sanded away almost perfectly, actually. There are no marks or anything. I thought, okay, this time I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to put the high numbers on the squish part. That way, if you roll a 20, as you can see here, I did have some problems with the 1 and the 7. There were raised faces, so the numbers are basically sanded off at this point. But given that these new ones have a lip to prevent the raised faces, I'm not so worried about that. I want you to see the frog when you roll a 20. I want you to get like excited and happy. So my previous logic was, if I'm going to mess up any face, it will be the 1 face. I think, as Ribinator once said, if you see the 1, you're already angry, so it doesn't matter if it's kind of ugly, but it is my hope that it won't be ugly. Fingers crossed, you guys. Yeah. So from now on, I'm going to start putting the high numbers on the face. Oh yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the D20. So here's a chunky D20 so you can see better, but if you want to do 2 faces on your D20, and that's another thing, if you choose to do 2 faces, you're gonna have a die that doesn't quite sit like flat. If you have it sitting on one side, the inclusion will be tilted just a little bit. I find that it doesn't matter so much to me. I kind of like the way it looks. I feel it adds a little bit of dynamic to it, but I know some people would probably want their inclusions to sort of sit perfectly, you know? If the 1 face is up, you see it flat, or whichever face you choose. But for example, this frog, he doesn't really sit completely flat. And I'm okay with that. But if you don't want that, you can choose instead to only squish 1 face on your D20. It will probably make it a little harder to pull out and a little harder to put big inclusions in. I didn't really have any problems with this old mold where I had 1 face. I did have to sort of like hold it open like this to put any large inclusions in there, but I had help for that. If you live alone and you make dice alone and you want to put like a really big fragile floral in your die, you probably want at least 2 faces, because as you can see, you can just use one hand to hold it open and the other hand to put stuff in, instead of this one where you kind of just like elongate the hole instead of stretching it to fit the inclusion. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you do end up choosing 2 faces, how do you decide which faces you want to use? When I was doing the lower faces, I chose 1, and then I also chose 7 because it is the number that takes up the least amount of space between 7, 12, and 13. 7 takes up less space. 7 would be easier to carve the vent into if I needed it. When it comes to the 20, I didn't look at the space that these numbers took. I just chose the 8 because if you want your 20 on the top, and it's not going to sit perfectly flat, would you rather have it sitting here or here or here, you know? Because if it's sitting here, it's still kind of facing up, as it were. Instead of like tilting to the side, it's tilting in the readable direction, I guess, is one way to say it. So that's why I chose the 8. But if you want to make dice that are more Random inclusions, some floral inclusions, doesn't really matter which face is up. I would recommend the one because again, it is the most likely to be messed up by the vent marks or sprue marks or anything or flashing. And the one face is already going to make people mad. This tutorial assumes a basic understanding of the mold making process. I'll be showing the D10 and the D20 on screen since the D10 is a bit of a funny shape and the D20 has two faces at the opening and it's the only mold with two faces at the opening. So, on to making the molds. I always start off by creating a thin, flat base of clay at the bottom of my cups. These are some cheap plastic shot glasses, and if I'm not wrong, they hold about 4 centiliters of liquid. The purpose of this base is to make a sticky surface that is easier to attach more clay to, since it adheres better to itself than the smooth plastic of the cup, which has no grip. I'm using a Posca pen, but really any object with a flat-ish surface on one end can be used to tamp the clay down. The next step is to create the base for the die to sit on. Please excuse my clay storage method. I know it can be hard to visualize the rest of the more oddly shaped dice when you only see a D6 being made, so I hope showing you the D10 instead will help you transfer the skills to the rest of the set more easily. Depending on the size of your cups, you may need more clay than I'm using here, but I wouldn't recommend using less. I'm creating a stumpy cylinder of sorts and using this paintbrush to press in the indent that will create the ledge that holds the cap down. Drop that puck into your cup, center it as best as you can, and press it lightly into the base. If your thumb doesn't bend like that, you can use any flat object. I use my thumb because it helps me moderate how hard I'm pressing. To help with the rest of this process, I'm using this kid's pottery tool that I had laying around, though I'm sure a small, shallow spoon or coffee stirrer would serve you just as well. I'm using it to press lightly around the edges of the cap base to secure it and create a surface with fewer crevices for silicone to get into. Ideally, you want the lip around your mold to be about 2 to 3 millimeters thick, so try to get the rim of the empty space around your clay to that width. Now I'm using the paintbrush again to push some indentations into the base to create orientation marks that will help me orient the cap later and keep the number on straight. I do 2 indentations on opposite sides and 2 adjacent surface indentations as shown. The next step is to create the squished in part of the cap that puts the number in your dice. Start by sticking a bit of modeling clay on a face of your choosing and shape it into roughly the right shape. Use any flat tool, you could probably use a credit card, to press the clay away from the edges of the face. This is the step that ensures you only need to polish one face and not the adjacent ones. I realize this is a long and finicky process, but you get faster and faster as you make more. By the time I made my last clay base, it took me only a fraction of the time it took for me to make my first. I'm sure there's a talented 3D printer out there who can model these for you in Blender and print them for you, so you don't have to use modeling clay at all, but I don't have the budget for that and I'm quite happy to sit and mold clay for an hour or two. I've also seen people use their molds to cast a resin piece that they then use as a base for future molds, so they only have to model each mold base once. I'm not super familiar with that process though, but if I figure it out in the future, I'd be happy to help you all out with that one as well. Here, I'm using my fingers to pinch the edges of the clay a bit upwards. This will just make it easier to stick onto the base you've prepared in the cup without pressing down too hard. Pressing too hard may push the clay out to the edges of the die face, meaning more cleanup later on. Make sure that even the pointy end is roughly parallel and doesn't slope too much. If it caves too much at the top, it may be hard to remove the pointy end of the die from the mold later on. The next step is to wipe the die down so it's nice and shiny. I'm using a microfiber cloth. Make sure to get every face, but also be aware that you need to touch at least 2 faces to place the die in the cup. Make sure the faces you touch will be facing upwards. Place it gently onto the base you made and be aware of where your orientation marks are. Press very gently and look through the die to make sure the clay hasn't been pressed out to the edges of the face. Then, use your spoon-looking tool to gently and carefully secure the edges. It can be really hard to do these things around a die in a tiny little cup, so you may find it easier with a larger container. I developed these molds with the tools I had lying around, which is why the tools seem so perfect to accomplish the task. If you don't have similar tools to help you get around the dice, you can try a different type of container. I've seen people construct mold containers using Lego, which can be secured onto a base after you're done sculpting your clay. I've also seen people make a thin base of clay in a tray, stick their dice onto that, and place cut toilet paper rolls or pipes around them. Both these methods will allow you free access to every side of the clay sculpt, and you can add the container walls afterwards. I'll try to find instructional videos on those methods and leave them in the description, but in the event that I can't, let me know in the comments if you have a link. The final step in this part of the process is to carefully wipe down the two faces that you touched to remove your fingerprints. Give it one final look to make sure the clay still looks okay on the other side, and you're good to go. Next, I'll be showing you the D20. I'm giving it a wipe down before we begin to just make sure it's as shiny as possible. We'll go through this one a little bit faster. I've sped up the creation of the base here, but in real time this took me about 3.5 minutes. Here, I'm shaping the clay into roughly the right form before attaching it, which can make things go faster. I'm giving it a push to stick it into the surface and cutting off the excess clay. It was still too thick, so I began pinching at it to remove some from the top, flatten it back out, and push the clay away from the edges. Then we go into pinching the sides flat, and I added a bit of clay back on because I found it was a little uneven. Wipe the dye down and it's ready to go in the mold. Secure the base and give it a final wipe, and there's your D20. Here I'm setting up to pour my silicone. I'll link the products I used in the description, but the silicone is an opaque tin cure silicone at a shore hardness of 15. The pot life is really short and the silicone is dried to the touch at about 15 minutes after mixing in the hardener. This means that I have to pour my dice in small batches as I can't pour fast enough to do more than 100 grams at a time. You likely don't have this issue with your silicone, so feel free to pour to the top of the cups in one sitting. I measure my hardener into a separate cup with a pipette and add it to the silicone. I don't know a lot about silicone, pressure pots, or vacuum chambers, and I won't be saying much more about them in this video, except that from what I gather and in my experience, you don't need a vacuum chamber if you pressure cure your molds. Ribinator has a lot of good information on those technical things on his channel, so if you need help, I'm sure you can pop over there and find everything you need. I pour half cups at a time and add reused silicone to the top half of the mold where I can make sure it's not in contact with any face of the die. I pressure cure my molds at 40 psi since I cure my dice at 35. Here you can see where the reused silicone scraps have created bumps at the surface of my molds, but that's fine because it gives me a good grip to pull them out of the cups and I can cut them off later. I use these same cups over and over again, like I do with my silicone mixing cup, so I don't want to break them open to get my molds out. Check to make sure your numbers are clear. I'm using a dried lavender twig here to get some clay out of a number in my D4. I don't recommend dried lavender, it's just what I had directly to my left. Make sure to give your faces a little wipe down. The next step is to apply Vaseline so the silicone doesn't adhere to itself when you pour your caps. I use a paintbrush, which is easiest for me, and the bristle structure slants into a point which helps me get into the corners. You want to go about this methodically. Mentally divide your mold into sections and do one section at a time, making sure that every millimeter is covered. I go by layers, starting from the bottom up. Don't forget the inner edges of the bottommost squish part. That's the most important and the least easy to save. Getting some Vaseline on the face of the die is unavoidable, but be sure that you don't touch the numbers. I also like to go over the top half of the outside of the mold to account for spillage. I forgot to film me pouring the caps, but you can see me pouring a D20 cap earlier in the video from a previous batch of molds. If you're smart, you'll add a circle of tape so you can go over the edge of the mold rim when you pour your caps, but if you're lazy like me, you'll survive without. The next step is to disassemble your cured and finished molds and rescue your master dice from inside. This is pretty simple, just ease along the edge to loosen it up and gently pull the cap out. If you applied the Vaseline well, it should come out easily and without much resistance. However, if you did miss a spot, don't panic. A steady hand and an X-Acto blade will get you where you need to go. Just carefully and slowly cut through the trouble spot. To create the vents, we are simply going to cut into the caps with a sharp X-Acto blade. Pick a slice of the cap that won't interfere with the orientation marks and make extra sure to avoid the numbers. The little triangle this creates as a vent is wide enough for me since I use a pressure pot and my resin is quite thin as far as resins go. You may need to cut a larger hole if you aren't using a pressure pot. I shave off a little extra off the top of the cap to make the reservoir larger without having to cut a larger vent. This is especially important on the D20 where there's more resin and therefore more shrinkage. If you do a pour and find your reservoir isn't big enough, just go back in and shave a little more off. I'm going to show you really quickly where the vents are cut in each die to help you figure things out in different layouts. I forgot to film the D6, but I think that one is pretty easy on its own. I hope you can figure it out. I cut the vent in the same spot on both my regular D20 and my 26mm D20, but I also want to show you the difference in placement between the regular and the chunk so you can see how to fit a chunker on there even with the orientation marks. Finally, we have the sample pour. I pour outside, so I'm sorry that the footage is a little shaky, but here we are, finally looking at the elusive D6 mold. I've already placed my inclusions in the mold, in this case florals, and I'm just pouring directly from the mixing cup into the mold. Of course, you can color and decorate your resin as you please. Give it a couple taps to shake some of the larger bubbles loose, and leave it for a minute while you fill the rest of your molds to allow air to rise. Go in with a stick of some kind to pop some of the big bubbles at the top and put the cap on. Remember, orient the mold using the marks you put on, turn it so that the vent is facing towards you, slide it in opposite first, and don't forget some taps for good luck. And there you have it. The supplies used are listed in the description, and if you have any questions, don't be shy.